You know, sometimes I'll go to my local mall just to hang out. With the lockdown slowly releasing constraints, I just miss wasting time at the local shops and window shopping. And the other day, when I was visiting a sport card shop because they had stocked the latest Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon cards, I had to stop when I came across a rather haphazardly put together display. It was a display of Huggy Wuggy plushies. Huggy Wuggy being that of the first monster in the indie horror game Poppy Playtime. And I couldn't help but just stare at the display for a few minutes, as the existential dread of being a horror fan slowly began to bile up in the pit of my stomach. I knew I had to talk about this. MangaKamen here. I am no stranger to talking about horror games on my channel. Granted, it's not my bread and butter, as YouTube seems to despise whenever I don't talk about things that aren't negative in nature. Except Metal Gear Rising, my god, for some reason YouTube loves that. But I've always loved the idea of horror games. I love playing them. Hell, as cliche as it sounds, one of my favorite early horror games was Silent Hill. My god, babies with knives! Nowadays, I can look back and laugh. But when I was a kid in the ancient year of 1999, this stuff was legitimately scary to me. The game's use of low graphical fidelity and the use of polygonal models really lent a lot to the imagination of a young kid who snuck into his grandmother's basement with a borrowed copy of Silent Hill from his friend to play the family PlayStation that was down there. Yeah, I was a Sega kid back then. I bet on the wrong horse! But that game, even with the crude graphics, was something that honestly scared me as a kid. And yeah, M-rated games little kids should be playing do that to you. But when you grow up in a Christian household and go to a Catholic school, you tend to do things without your folks finding out. Hopefully my mother's not watching this video right now. Regardless, I bring this up just to give you guys an idea of where I stand with my horror games and roots. I played a ton of different horror games as I grew older and older, and some of them good, some of them bad, some of them fun, and others made me want to rip my hair out because of how frustrating they were. And as I got older, my fascination with games and games development grew. Even games that horror elements drew my attention. It's why I love the Dead Rising series and how I hated how that series was butchered.
He's still Frank, but you know, his sense of humor is better.
You messed with my camera again, right?
You're a quick one.
That's what she said.
The idea of surviving hostile environments with monsters chasing you down and the mystery of what's happening is something that drew my attention. I love mysteries, and horror can have some of the best mysteries as they can branch out into more psychological crises. Even something as simple as Ib is a game that had that same element. Sure, it wasn't as iconic as, say, the zombie turn in Resident Evil, but it's a game that I really want to talk about later. Hell, a lot of games that aren't horror-based can have horror elements to them that I enjoy. I've talked about this before, but I have memories of being afraid of Goma in Ocarina of Time, and the official art didn't help either. Now we come to today, where we have a ton of games that fall under the umbrella of horror, Omori being a psychological horror and at the same time cute. Yeah, I still want to make a video on that game. God, I got a lot on my plate. But not every horror game nowadays is to my taste, and hey, that's fine. What I say here is an objective standard. Well, save for the BS that's behind some of these games, stuff like what scares a person is totally going to be subjective. What scares one person is going to scare another. Horror is a very messy genre because of that, and sometimes there's things in games that take you out of it. In this video, I'm going to go outline some issues that I have with modern day horror games. The first will be lore issues and story, the second will be technical and gameplay issues, and the third will be the behind the scenes and corporate issues. And this will potentially have spoilers for the following games, so I'm just going to be on the safe side and give a bit of disclaimer for the following games and lore pieces. I want it to be known that I don't really hate these games. Hell, some of them I don't really represent the issues here. Rather, I have issues with them and I can make a video about them all and possibly milk the ad revenue, but that's not what my channel is really about. Besides, it just makes more sense to talk about all this in one big video. So, with all that out of the way, let's get into it.
It's a funny thing, how so much can fall apart so fast.
Having a good story for your game isn't a requirement to make a good game, but when it comes to horror games, you need to have something to latch onto. I stated earlier that baiting a mystery as to why you're here, what made these events happen, why this funny bunny girl is chasing after me in a pizzeria, all those are questions can entice a player into delving deeper and deeper into a game, trying to find any and all clues to the story, and that's great! Hell, it's because of deep lore that the FNAF series even got off the ground and really made a name for itself. The mystery, the allure, the tragic backstory of kids being... Yeah, that's why I don't talk about horror games so much, because YouTube doesn't like me talking about them. But back on track, that's what can really pull a person into a horror game. Even if not into the full-on mood to be scared, a good narrative can really pull a person into it, regardless of gameplay or horror stuff. As of late though, and By late, I mean over the last few years, there have been a number of issues with horror game stories. One of the biggest issues that some games are episodic. You had Bendy and the Ink Machine, and the current one is Poppy Playtime. Now, to make things clear, I understand why some games are episodic. Some games lack the funds to make a full-on game, or there's something going on with the creators behind the scenes that just makes it hard to get the games done. For that, I understand, but just because there's a justification, that doesn't mean I have to like it. Granted, I've got a bit of a bias against games that are released episodically.
Jesus, I shot myself!
But there are issues to releasing your games episodically, especially when it comes to narratives. Namely, you run the risk of ignoring crucial plot points, or including details that weren't actually initially planned. Or in the case of some games, trying to capitalize on information in the game through NFTs and doing some pretty scummy things. But that's for later. Let's look towards Bendy and the Ink Machine. In a Reddit AMA on The Kindly Beast, Mike Mood said the following: "We innovate in other ways. By our stories, our characters, and our brands. Not how we make our games." Then you'll also have Meatly, aka Paul Crawford, the lead creator of the game, saying this:
Bendy is a very complex universe of interesting characters, both human and cartoon alike. But the truth is, from the beginning, I've had the whole story in mind. I know exactly where it's going to go, I know exactly what each character is going to do, and it's just a really cool thing to see it all come together like this. Yes, little things change here and there between chapters, but the main story itself has still remained untouched.
You really think someone would do that?
Now, if you're familiar with the final chapter of the game and some of the internet's reactions to it, you'll find out that a lot of people found it disappointing. But wait a minute, Mike Mood said this.
You know, we'd like to say we knew exactly what was going to happen, but really, at the end of the day, we knew the beginning and we knew the end of the game. Everything that happened in between was kind of developed as we went along.
Lies?
To make it clear, while developing a story, and if you have a fan base that's interacting with you, it's going to take feedback. But it opens up a lot of nasty possibilities that can overclock your story, where you introduced elements into said story that weren't supposed to be there in the first place and can bloat your story and change the ideas you had. It's something that a lot of game developers tend to overestimate when they're making games, and something you see in a lot of early developers. Ignorant ambition and underestimating game development are massive contributors to this possibility, and sometimes you'll end up with a messy story in a world that things had added to it that weren't supposed to be there initially. In the case of Bendy and the Ink Machine,
Bendy and the Ink Machine, at the end of chapter 5, it explains what the story is and it brings it to a close. And it does answer a lot of questions and it does raise more. However, what we have done is left it up to the community. So if you play the game, and you play the game, and you play the game, and your name is MatPat.
Hello, Internet!
theory crafting is fine, but because the ending leaves up so many questions up in the air, that means there won't be an actual answer to the story, effectively using the fan theories to do the heavy lifting for their story. Hell, Mike Mood says this: "The perk to an episodic game is that sometimes theorists or straight up feedback will give us ideas to expand upon our universe and story." Granted, you can chalk this up to some deception on their end, but hey, this ain't the video section for that. Now, instead let's get back to focusing on the lore aspect. Now, a design like this isn't inherently bad, but it's obvious from what I've shown you that the game's story was designed specifically to have people keep talking about the game well after release, or to keep up interest in the game as other episodes are being developed. As a developer, I can appreciate this sort of thing as you want to be able to keep interest up in your project while you're making it. The last thing you want to happen is to have your project end up in the dust.
It's all about me!
That being said, there's still something that really annoys me about this sort of strategy where you keep adding elements into a story that doesn't really get a lot of resolution, or just make the story overly bloated. And sometimes, in the case of FNAF Security Breach, the story is told in such a jumbled mess that the endings make no sense, like how Vanny was supposed to be this very important character, but ended up not showing up a whole lot in the game. Kind of a letdown if I'm honest, because especially since I like bunnies.
Congratulations on completing your work week. We apologize if your situation wasn't presented to you in a completely honest fashion when you first started, but it was important that your intentions and actions be genuine.
Actually, speaking of FNAF, while its games aren't episodic, they do hold a lot of influence, as each game could be seen as a chapter in and of itself. Think about it, each installment came out relatively quick initially, and basically added more characters, more of what people wanted with the gameplay, and obviously added more lore. I am stretching things a bit here, I understand that, but when I see horror games coming out in chapters, I feel like this is what they're trying to replicate. The only difference is that they had to focus on one game instead of making various others. But who knows? This is me typing out a script at 3 AM in the morning with 2 bottles of Powerade and still coming down in a kick of judgment. Story is important in games. I'd even say more so in horror games because you have the element of fear, something that will drive people away, so you need to be able to hook people with other elements of your game, whether it be the art style, the core story, or even the gameplay itself. Speaking of...
Okay, but how do I get out of here?
Do you see the large vent in the floor?
Let's get this out of the way. I am a gameplay guy first and foremost. I don't normally care if a game's graphics are lacking, so long as the game is good. Granted, some games you don't need gameplay to keep my attention, but it certainly helps. Now, if we trace back to a ton of older horror games, there's always been a similar gameplay loop that's still being used to this day. Fetch quests. Even the early days of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there was always one of these every so often. We need to find a thing and put it into a place in order to continue onwards. Now, you're probably thinking, Common, this is something you can complain about every game genre, not just horror games. And you are completely right. This is something that a lot of games deal with. However, to that, I say, a problem is a problem regardless. And I never said this was just a horror game exclusive issue. But as I said, this is a core element to a lot of games, horror especially. I suppose my issue is with the oversaturation with it. Hell, if you go back to some of the older horror games that made horror games the thing, Slender Man.
Sorry, Scott Cawthon. I'm tired of waiting for you.
It was essentially a giant fetch quest. And hey, if that's what you like, that's perfectly fine. To me though, there's a bit too much of a saturation going on. Whether it be indie or mainstream games, this gameplay loop is one that I'm slowly getting annoyed with. Not every game has this, but has a variation of it, and sometimes the item is to complete something before continuing onwards. Granted, when you're playing a gameplay loop, it wholly depends on what you're doing to get the items that you need to continue with that can change this. Let's look towards FNAF's security breach.
The hell is that?
You know what it is, bitch.
Bang!
I already made a full-on review on it at the end of last year, so I won't be going too far into it, but a lot of the quests in that game were essentially fetch quests so you continue laying on. All the while dodging the animatronics, they had the ability to phase in and out of areas or appear out of nowhere, and don't get me started on the BS with the inability to save at the final stretch of the game. But let's swap to a different game, Poppy's Playtime, more specifically Chapter 2, which had an improvement from the first chapter but still had its issues. For those unfamiliar with the game, in the first chapter you get an item called the Grab Pack, which allowed you to have extending arms that help you with puzzles. For example, having electricity search you with the arm to power up things it touched. It wasn't revolutionary, but it gave the game a bit of its own identity, which is more important when it comes to horror games. In Chapter 2, you're given the ability to swing across gaps or pull yourself up to other areas with it, which, hey, I can appreciate that a lot. It's used to help escape the bubblegum pink doll clone of Stretch Armstrong, albeit it has its issues with that, but fundamentally it's a good addition to the mechanics. However, we then get to the chapter's main gameplay loop, which is to solve a puzzle to get to the objective areas, do a tedious minigame like Simon Says, Whack-A-Mole, and Red Light, Green Light, and then do another puzzle to leave the room. And I wouldn't have much of a problem with this if the game didn't just waste my time so much and were basic. Like, Simon Says is not an engaging game. Why are games putting this in? The issue is that it's insanely repetitive and takes too long to complete.
You're boring me back to death.
And I know, it's wholly a subjective stance, and something I'm not disagreeing with, but there has to be a way to fix the pacing with this stuff. And you have to do this stuff in order to complete the game. If it were optional content and gave you extra tidbits about the world or such, and not the actual gameplay loop for the main story, then I wouldn't be making a fuss of this. But unfortunately, we live in the world of darkness and despair, and I have to talk about this. I should also talk about some of the confusing direction at times in the horror games. Sticking with Poppy Playtime, there are two examples I want to give. At the end of the third minigame, the red light, green light one, you have to come up to a busted wall that you can't do anything at all. What you're supposed to do is look up and see an orange light that'll tell you where to grab. Pull yourself towards it and break through some glass. How was I supposed to know to do that? I'm not the only one who had to deal with this. Markiplier was also dealing with it.
You cannot be serious with this. This is baloney. Why would I be stuck? What? Where am I going? Where? What?
It's not a big deal.
I feel somewhat vindicated. The other time is when you're being chased, and this was a problem in the first chapter too, where the big monster of the chapter chases you through the vents, and at some point you're supposed to take a specific path you can easily miss. And when the demented cousin of Princess Bubblegum is chasing you in chapter 2, you can find some areas that you can grab onto and pull yourself up to dodge her. Too bad during a frantic situation you're not going to have time to look around and escape with the grab pack. Even more so when you want your players to look up. I know, it sounds weird, but there's a documentation in this. Take Portal for example. Making players look up without prompt is something difficult to do, even more so when they're put under pressure. So unless you're already familiar with all these hiding spots beforehand, and even then players will die and die and die again and again, and it just causes frustration. Like, you can even say this about older horror games like Outlast that had like all of these things happening. Again, it's very subjective, and I'm willing to admit that I could just be a dumbass who doesn't understand game design. What is fact is glitches.
Oh, I see.
And a disclaimer, I am well aware that a lot of games that I've talked about have gotten updates and patches that fix some of the issues that I've had to deal with when I played these games when they came out. And that's good, but that doesn't negate the fact that these issues were problems with the games that I and others experienced when they came out. Just because you fixed the issue doesn't mean it wasn't an issue, nor should it be ignored. And if they're fixed, then I don't hold that against the developers. What I can hold them to is not fully testing their games before release to catch these bugs. Now, I know there are games that are under tight time crunches, and I can appreciate that. However, that doesn't really matter if a game has so many glitches that it sours your enjoyment of a game. So yeah, I'm still annoyed at that too.
Clearly the way that he's summoned now has changed. I think what they did was make Freddy come to you from farther away and not teleport so much. But in doing so, it seems like they broke him entirely!
What are you waiting for? Come visit the factory.
I want to make something clear that I'm a big proponent of separating the art from the artist, especially when it comes from collaborative efforts too. Normally, if you got one person who's really shitty and they're part of a team, I don't think the team should suffer because of that one person. Still, that's dependent on who you are and how much you can tolerate. That being said, everyone has their limits to something, and this is no exception. This kind of stuff isn't just a problem with indie horror games, but games in general, especially in the modern day. Yes, I am talking about drama, in a sense, since I need to talk about briefly about how some dramas involving a couple games, and how some of them can really turn people away from the franchises.
Of course, that would only be a serious danger if there were something outside that's been trying to get in for months now, which we are not confirming to be the case.
So Poppy Playtime and Enchanted Mob. Whew, that's a hornet's nest. From accusations of poor workplace management for employees for Enchanted Mob, like firing animators who asked for a pay raise or made complaints, or contributing to harassment to a username Echo Coaster for using a channel called Animation Sins to criticize him, quote unquote. Selling lore of their game as an NFT, charging $5 for a tech demo. Whoops! Now the first chapter is $3, but chapter 2, $10, please!
Fuck you! Fuck you!
Or if you want to talk about more about something like the Kindly Beast, aka the creators of Bendy and the Ink Machine, they fired several employees before the holidays with no notice, mismarketing, blatant lying, stealing ideas and artwork from their fans without consent, workplace abuse, and not making a polished product because they believe their fans will not care. Hell, I remember when people got upset because Scott Cawthon donated money to politicians. Or to get away from these bigger examples, take Omori and their creator Omocat. I'm not saying they did anything like I've mentioned before, but the game was highly delayed by several years when they initially started the project in 2014, and they wanted to get the game out in 2015. Tons of backers took issue with that along with some mismanagement on Omocat's side. Now, part of the reason why I'm not going too in-depth with these controversies is because, one, I don't want to get back into drama myself. Because of recent events,
Wow! Wow!
it's solidified to me that drama of any kind can easily blow up in your face. And two, I'm not the right person to go over controversies like this, especially when they've been well documented on YouTube by people who are more interested in talking about that subject matter. I only bring this up in small digestible manner to explain that behind the scenes issues can have major effects on whether or not someone wants to support indie horror games, and how this seems to be an ever increasing problem. There's also the manner that I brought up in the beginning of the video where I talked about Poppy Playtime merchandise, and that's honestly a red flag to me. The game has only 2 chapters out at the time of me writing and scripting and saying this stuff right now, but it's already having a lot of merchandise made from it. It really comes off as more of a product for the sake of making money than as a creation of love and entertainment. Then again, you could say the same thing about a game like Deltarune, which had merchandise made of it already when it came out too.
If you're enjoying this parody, don't forget to subscribe. Also, sorry, back to parody.
But at least with Deltarune, Toby Fox didn't give you a reason to think that he was doing this all for the money, and had already established a lot of goodwill with those who liked his game and is still working hard on Deltarune. as far as we know. I know it's a nebulous term, but it feels like there's no actual soul when there's already a flood of merchandise being made for a game that hasn't fully come out yet. Maybe that's the cynic in me talking, but as I've gotten older, I've come to view these things with much more skepticism, and I really don't trust that kind of thing nowadays. But here's where we come to a twist, that there's a much bigger factor as to why there are problems with modern-day horror games.
Say that again? Well, it's just a theory.
Oh, a game!
Oh, slow down there, peanut butter jelly time. Let's not jump the gun here.
I'm not happy. For good reason, because when you consider everything I've said so far, there's one big contributor to the problem, and that's YouTube. I won't be the first person to say this, but YouTube has a large amount of influence on horror games. Hell, not just even horror games, but games in general. I've shown earlier with the Bendy and Ink Machine reference to
MatPat.
And trust me, yes, we'll be getting to that. Just give me a minute before you type that in the comments. But YouTube and many YouTubers in general have helped push tons of games. Some good, others bad, and this is for the sake of pushing content out for their YouTubers who need to continuously make more and more content for their audiences, and the games get free advertising as they're exposed to incredibly large audiences. Even more so when you have YouTube creators actually being a part of the game itself, since that'll draw the attention of the audience even more so. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing inherently. Games getting promoted to help out the developers and get more people interested in the materials is never a bad thing. And as we've seen with FNAF, it can create worldwide sensations. The problem is when it really starts to affect the games, or the games are being made with the express purpose of farming money from unsuspecting kids. The best example is Enchanted Mob, the people behind Poppy Playtime, a channel that knows exactly how to milk its young audience by hitting some of the most favorite trends for kids. And as I brought up, you've already got stuff like merchandise, fan animations, and even a movie in the works when the game only has 2 chapters in. I'm sorry, but that reeks of money grubbing to me instead of actually putting passion into the project. And I know that's unfair of me to say because there are a lot more people who are working on the game. But this effect is more highlighted when you consider...
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Game Theory!
This'll definitely put the sting of defeat in his soul.
Now, if you've been on my channel in the past, or have any idea of what I used to do, you know that I have my issues with MatPat.
Logic is sound. So let's take a look at the top 7 worst of Game Theory's videos that don't really follow this, okay? I won't be doing a full debunking of the theories themselves. I will bring up some points on why the theory is wrong.
Not the hater!
There it is, there was the scream.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Very, very nice.
Well done.
Let's put that aside for now and let's talk how this affects horror games. You see, while Let's Players can help boost the popularity of a game, normally the videos they make will be rather limited and be done in a day or two. Unless it's a super long game, which oddly enough is a rarity, that boost will only last until the next game the Let's Player comes out with. And that's when game theory comes into play. If your game has enough lore aspects and catches the attention of MatPat and Let's Players, you'll be able to get much more eyes in your game and it'll last longer as it'll open up something more intriguing. Especially when you take in consideration MatPat's videos take time to edit, research, and it'll take more effort to put into than a regular Let's Play. And then there's something intriguing that people will talk about. Lore. I brought up lore and how you have a question raised to your audience and opens up the idea of theory crafting. And we've seen this not just with horror games, but countless other games too. To varying success and credibility if you ask me, but that's neither here nor there. We've also seen the after effects of this too. Now, I could point to Bendy and the Ink Machine, again, but let's talk about Hello Neighbor. If you're not familiar with the franchise, Hello Neighbor started off as a unique horror game where you broke into a guy's house, and the guy would chase after you until you got caught, or until you got off his property. The unique thing about this game was that the AI of the pursuer would change and grow, so it would learn anything about your previous tactics that you used to get away from him and counter them. But unfortunately, when Game Theory started crafting videos about the lore, the popularity boost from it seemed to turn the developers into wanting more focus on the lore instead of the gameplay. Like, there's an icon making towards MatPat, and unfortunately, if you know know anything about Hello Neighbor, you'll find that the game slowly turned into a mess of confusing platforming and puzzles that weren't really standard puzzles, and ended with a weird void where to beat the game you had to keep going to a crying kid.
What the hell is this?
Now if you look towards something like Poppy Playtime, you can see they're essentially creating the game to be fueled by the YouTube algorithm and system. MapPad has made a number of theories about the game, and as stated before, the game already has merchandise, NFTs, and even a deal to make a movie, one that was supposedly made before Chapter 2 even came out. This system works, and if a developer can strike gold, more power to them, but when it comes to stuff like this, I can't really see anything all that good. I see a lack of passion for the craft, and just seeing all this as well as how the games turn out at times, I don't want to touch the games again, and I don't want to see what other games do this if they fall into this vein. There's a lack of quality control in my mind. They don't feel indie. They feel like the AAA market. And I don't say that as a compliment.
Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth, if you still even remember that name, but I'm afraid you've been misinformed.
I started this video off by talking about my experiences with older horror titles, and how I love the horror genre. Sure, I don't talk about it much on my channel, but that's because I prefer to keep my vice to myself, and hey, who knows, maybe if my audience likes this video enough, I'll talk about horror games more often. But to get back on topic, when it comes to horror games, or games in general, I think these are risks that we're just going to have to accept going forward, and that's kind of sad. Gaming has become so accessible to many people, and not just for playing, but for creating them too. And sometimes you'll get issues with that because the level of quality of both the games and the people behind the games will be shaky, and I think that's a problem. I know, I'm Captain Obvious here, but sometimes you need to speak the obvious because the obvious isn't as obvious as people are like to obviously think. I want to like these horror games, but there are things in them that push me away, some more than others, and I don't know. It's hard for me to really explain, but I guess I'm disappointed. I still want to see what horror games are going to be made in the future, because the indie scene's where it's at. I'm MangaKamen, and thanks for watching. If you liked the video, leave a comment. Tell me what your favorite horror game is, or if you haven't actually played any horror games, what kind of horror game do you want to play? Let me know, because I genuinely want to know, because I want to make more content that's more positive, and yeah, I know, ironic talking about a video that's negative, but I don't know, I kind of really want to get into talking about horror games and such, but hey, I'm just rambling right now. Thanks for watching, and thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a nice day.
This ends, for all of us, in communication.